To True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I am your host, Annette Lyon, USA Today bestselling author of Just One More and a whole bunch of other books. Today's chocolate, Dove Silky Smooth Dark. Today we're discussing Chad Daybell and his trial, which officially kind of began yesterday, but is really, at this point, jury selection. We aren't into the full-on trial yet. That will be at least a week out, most likely, because choosing a death penalty jury is a trickier proposition than one that is not when the death penalty is on the table, as it is with Chad. So far, we have 20 as of Tuesday evening. So 2 days of jury selection. We have 20 potential jurors. The way that they're doing this in Idaho, they send out a massive questionnaire. I've heard it's 20 to 30 pages long, very detailed, and based on the answers in those questionnaires, and they call people into court, and then they question them individually. And it can be anything, very personal things, such as, I don't know what's on the questionnaire, but for example, knowing that Chad and Lori had an affair, they could say, well, do you have an experience with that? Would that taint your opinion? And maybe change how you would, vote and deliberate and that kind of thing. Then you'll have other things like, will there be a hardship on you if you have to serve in this capacity for a long time? They're estimating this trial may last up to 10 weeks, which is about twice as long as Lori's, because I imagine this is, again, it's a death penalty case. That was not the case with Lori. A death penalty was removed. And death penalty adds a couple of layers of complication. So in the state of Idaho, from what I understand, I'm not a lawyer, but this is from what I've gathered from various sources, from journalists and people who know more than I do. They bring in groups of potential jurors. So on Monday, day one, they brought in 2 groups of 16, and then they would question them individually. And from there, they would pull ones that they think would be good prospects, not necessarily jurors yet. So they brought in 32 potential in 2 different groups yesterday, Monday, and then they ended up with 16 potential jurors, which is actually more than I would have anticipated, because you would think that, if it was, you'd have more people that would be like, oh, I have a problem with the death penalty, and oh, never mind, you're stricken, you can't serve, that kind of thing. So who knows? Today, my understanding is, instead of a group of 16 and 2 groups, they only had 1 group of 13. And of those 13, 4 remained to be added to the pool. So we have 20 potential jurors, but we need to reach somewhere close to 50. The goal is to get 50, then they whittle down from there to get the official jurors. Apparently in Lori's case, they got to about 46-ish, somewhere in that ballpark. They didn't quite hit 50. But apparently they deemed it close enough, and they had done their due diligence, and then they start whittling it down. And then that's when the prosecution and the defense both can say, we don't want this person, just boom, gone for whatever reason. I don't know how many of those just free strikes they get, but they can say definitely not this one. And then they whittle it down further, and they will end up with 18, as they did in Lori's trial. 12 will be deliberating, and then they will have 6 alternates. However, all 18 will be present every day of the trial, and no one will know, including them, which ones will be deliberating, which ones are the alternates, until the day comes to then deliberate, and their names will be drawn. And then you'll find out which are the alternates. Why do they have 6 alternates? Because you don't know what's going to happen. You need to have 12 people in that room to deliberate who have been vetted and are willing and able to do this job. And if someone gets sick, or if someone has an emergency, or whatever happens, and you end up losing 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever, up to 6, you've got that cushion of extra jurors to draw from. I do know that after Lori's case, it was kind of heartbreaking for the 6 who were alternates, deemed alternates at the last minute, because all 18 lasted the entire trial, not one dropped out. And it was very hard to say, I went through this whole trial, I took my job very seriously, and I didn't even get to deliberate. That would be hard. Oh, my heart goes out to those people. At the same time, it was an important job that you did, even if you didn't deliberate. The fact that you were there allowed the justice system to work. So at this point, we have 20 of the potential 50 into the pool, which is more than I thought after 2 days of jury selection. We still, again, have to get up to close to 50 and then whittle it back down to 18. But if we're already up to 20, that's almost halfway in 2 days. So that's actually a lot better than I anticipated. Of the 16 that were picked on Monday, half were men, half were women. According to Nate Eaton of East Idaho News, he's the one I've been following for most of my coverage for the years. I've been following this case way before my channel began. In fact, during Lori's trial, I would follow his playlist every day. Then they would upload the audio, and then I would bump it up to 1.5 or so speed, and listen. I listened to everything that he uploaded. So I highly recommend his playlists on all of this stuff. So he said that there was half male, half female, and then on top of that they had all kinds of different. They had different races, they had different religions, whatever, which I thought was fascinating, especially because Idaho is kind of a homogenous state. So it's kind of cool that they got so much diversity. So go Idaho. So also on Monday, Nate through the East Idaho News broadcasted an interview with one of Lori's defense attorneys. So this was John Thomas, I believe. There's also John Pryor, who was one of Chad's lawyers. So I two Johns, I can get them mixed up. I'm pretty sure it's John Thompson he talked to. So I recommend looking into that. I'll link to it in the description below. And he was just explaining some of the death penalty situations in Idaho and the considerations. So in order for a case to be a death penalty case, according to John Pryor, number one, it has to involve homicide. There is no such thing as a death penalty case in Idaho. I would venture anywhere in the U.S. That it does not involve murder. In order to be death penalty, you need to have other circumstances on top of just being murder. It has to be maybe multiple individual victims. You need to have particularly heinous methods. Or if it's a police officer who was slain, it's immediately on the table as a death penalty case, which I thought was interesting as well. And there's also the element of the likelihood of reoffending. How dangerous is this person if they were to get out? Which I also thought was interesting, because life in prison without the possibility of parole would do the same thing. But apparently that can be a consideration with death penalty. He also talked about how when you're having death penalty cases, there's a first chair and a second chair. And it was essentially the lead attorney and then like the co-counsel kind of situation. I don't know the exact terminology. And he said that he's been second chair several times, but he's never actually done a full death penalty case as second chair, and that's what's required to become a first chair. So he's never actually done that. He himself is anti-death penalty. I'll post actually a TikTok I did not too long ago about my opinions on the death penalty, which I think are a little more nuanced and different than what most people would expect. So I will post that soon. But so because with death penalty cases, you can go into more depth about all kinds of different things and different witnesses you're allowed to bring in, especially in the penalty phase. So yeah, that's what happens then with the jury. There's two phases to the trial when you're dealing with a death penalty case. There's what we envision mostly of the trial. That's arguing and trying to prove guilt or innocence. Then the jury goes and deliberates, comes back with a verdict. If the verdict is guilty, the attorneys go and begin the second phase, which is arguing for which sentence. And the only two options, either death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. Those are the only options. And they have to be ready. They have to go in knowing that they have to be ready to begin those arguments the minute the jury comes in with their ruling. They probably wouldn't begin that as part of the trial until maybe a day or two or so later, but it will be close by, and the attorneys are not going to have months and months to prepare. They need to be ready to go, according to John Thomas. See, I knew I was going to mess that up. John Thomas. So in the penalty phase, they're allowed to bring in all kinds of character witnesses, anyone or any situation that might help argue to the jury that this person who has now been convicted of murder has some redeeming value and their life is worth sparing. They'd be like, oh, and their second grade teacher noticed this poor kid was definitely neglected at home and had all these problems. Or it could be, oh, well, this person that they happened to know in their first job, he said, oh, they was so reliable and he was so welcoming to everybody and was so kind and he helped this person and was a hero in the situation. Anything that could give this person redeeming value in the eyes of the jury. Something else I thought was very interesting is that Idaho is now going to have the firing squad as an option for execution. And I find this particularly interesting and actually rather odd. It's this new thing. So it kind of made national headlines not too long ago when Utah still had the firing squad on the books, and a prisoner, I want to say it was one of the Lafferty brothers, I will double check on that, who picked firing squad because he knew it would get headlines and it would be salacious and he wanted that kind of attention. Ended up dying of natural causes in prison. Didn't actually end up being executed, but it was still on the books in Utah. And it seemed at the time that people in Utah were like, oh, that's kind of an embarrassment. We should get that off the books. But now Idaho is building a new facility to allow firing squad executions to happen. It's under construction right now. So that struck me as interesting. In the Cold podcast, which is through KSL, which is a Utah NBC affiliate, fascinating podcast. Highly recommend listening to it. The first season is about Susan Powell and her disappearance. And the most, is it third season, I think, most recent? Don't quote me on that. But they talked to a man who used to work in the prisons and was part of the execution teams and that kind of stuff. And he gave his perspective on the firing squad situation and how he thinks it's dumb and shouldn't be used for a lot of reasons. But one thing that stuck with me from that interview, and I don't remember his name, so I apologize. The different rifles. I don't remember how many there are. I want to say at least 4, and then you have one with a blank, and the others have real bullets, or vice versa. I don't remember the exact number. But the idea is that your gun might have a blank in it, and someone else's will have the actual bullet. So you don't know if you pulled the trigger, but you don't know if you're the one who actually shot and killed the inmate. And he says that's ridiculous because anyone who has experience with firearms, and I do not, so I'm just saying what he said, would know they can tell when they shoot a rifle if it's a blank or if it's a real bullet. So especially if you are trained enough that you can serve in that capacity, that your aim is that good and you know what you're doing, you're going to be able to tell immediately whether you actually shot a bullet or not. So I thought that was an interesting little take. I hadn't thought about that. One thing also to note, very last bit. So I'm recording this Tuesday evening. By the time it goes up, Nate's interview will probably be live, but I wanted to mention it. That Nate Eaton, again, East Idaho News, he says that Keith Morrison, as in like the father of true crime, NBC, Dateline, Keith Morrison, is going to be interviewed by him on the East Idaho News YouTube channel and all the places where he posts. I am excited. I love Keith Morrison. He's one of my favorites, as he is for a lot of people. And he's going to give some interesting insights, I think, in comparing the 2 trials between Lori and Chad and that kind of thing. So I'll be tuning into that. And I suggest you do too. And Nate also mentioned that Nancy Grace is coming on his show later this week. So I definitely just watch Nate's feed. He does good work through East Idaho News. And throughout this whole trial, he does a live called Courtroom Insider every evening during the trial period. Again, if you miss it live, or you're like me and like listen to things fast, then you can catch it after the fact and then do it faster speed. I believe he begins at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time every evening after court. So that's where we stand at this point, 2 days in. So we'll see what happens moving forward. I am interested to see what is going to happen with Chad, particularly with his children. If the children are going to be testifying, especially his son who was there moving his mother's body and that kind of thing. I want to say his name was Garth. Could be wrong on that, but that's what I'm remembering offhand. So we'll see what happens. For last we heard with the interview on 48 Hours, I think it was, Chad's kids still stood in his corner and thought he had been framed. So based on everything that came out in Lori's trial and since, I think Chad will probably be convicted. We shall see. Enjoy your chocolate, because you got to have something sweet in the middle of all this bitter, right? And tune in again tomorrow. I'm sure we'll do something with the Daybell trial.